Hey, it's Jolly Yakuter. Hope you're doing well. And today we're back with some more Minecraft Dungeons. Well, kinda. That's because today I want to be ranking every single artifact there is in the game. So once again, we got another tier list, and I just want to go through every artifact in the game and just rank them on what I like and what I like to use. And yeah, let's get started. All right, up first is the Shadow Shifter. And this one's kind of an interesting one because it just puts you into shadow form, and it puts you in the shadow form for like a good long while. But I personally don't think it's like super good unless you're trying to speed run or something like that, because most of the time, at least for me, I'm killing the mobs. I'm not trying to run past them. And so for that, I'm just going to put it middle of the road into C tier. Up next is the fishing rod. And I'm not a huge fan of this one, though I don't think it's too bad, especially because you can pull mobs off the edge with it, and I just think that's kind of funny to do. But not too great. I think this also just belongs kind of just middle of the road in C tier. Up next is the Power Shaker, and I actually really like this one because I believe it gives you 4 charges, and it actually does like insane amounts of damage. Like, it can hit for a lot, and so it's going into A tier. Next is the Wonderful Wheat, and I'm not a huge fan of it. It just summons a Lawmet, and like it does okay amounts of damage, but if I'm going to use a pet, I'd much rather use like an Iron Golem, so it's going into D tier. Up next is the Lightning Rod, and even though I barely use soul builds, I still do think that this one's quite good. It's not great for crowd control, but it does do tons of damage, so it's going into A tier. Next is the Spin Blade, and I don't think this one's very good, so it's going into D tier. Next is the Tome of Casting, and it's definitely going in an F tier just because it doesn't make sense to have one of your artifacts reset your other 2 artifacts, especially when you're playing by yourself like I am most of the time, though I could see how this could be good if you were playing with other people. Up next is the Satchel of Elixirs, and I actually don't think this one's too bad, so I think it's just kind of middle of the road and it's going into C tier. Up next is the Enchanted Grass, and it's not too bad, except for the work that you have to go through to get it just makes it not very good. Like, it is fun to find all the secrets in the levels to get the ruins and then go through the secret level, but you'd think with finding all the secrets and everything like that, it'd make the artifact a lot better, but to be honest, it's just not very good, and so it's going into D tier. Next is the Eye of the Guardian, and I think most people would agree that this is F tier because it's basically just a corrupt beacon, but worse. Up next is the Tasty Bone, and I think this belongs in the same tier as the Wonderful Wheat for most of the same reasons I mentioned for the Wonderful Wheat. Next is the Ghost Cloak, and I don't think this is like an insane artifact. Unless you're speedrunning, if you're speedrunning, then I think this artifact is like really, really good. And I mean, it's alright to use just normally, but I think it belongs in B tier. Next is the Void Quiver, and these are actually really good even though I hardly ever use them, because they apply the Void Touch like enchantment on mobs and stuff, which basically just makes them take more damage. I think it's like 4 times more damage or something. I know it's a lot. So these are going into A tier because they can make you do a lot more damage. Next is the Tome of Duplication, and I actually think this one can be pretty good, and that's mostly for the fact of, for a little bit, I like to use this one for, I'd gather souls and then find something like arrows. So how this works is the last item you picked up is something that you can duplicate again. So I normally go find arrows and then run off to like a little corner where I knew I was safe, and then I would just keep on duplicating arrows, so I just have like a bunch of arrows, and then I would just change out the artifact because it's not very good just for anything else. It's basically just good for getting something that you want to use again. So I like to use it for duplicating arrows, so I think it can be good, so it's going into B tier. Up next is the Light Feather, and I think it just belongs in middle of the road in C tier. Next is the Wind Horn, and I think it also belongs in middle of the road in C tier. Next is the Blast Fungus, and I actually think these ones are quite good. It shoots out like 5 little, basically bombs that just go kind of all around you, and they actually do a good bit of damage, so I think these belong in A tier. Next is the Gong of Weakening, and I think it belongs in B tier. Next are the Scatter Mines, and I feel like they would go in the same tier as the Blast Fungus, but I don't think they're as good because it only sets out 3 mines, and you can also walk on your own mines, so it can damage yourself, which personally I'm not a huge fan of because I don't want my own artifact be doing damage to me. So for that, it's going to go 1 tier lower than the Blast Fungus to B tier because they can do lots of damage, but I'm just not a huge fan. Next is the Satchel of Snacks, and I just don't see a huge use case for this one, so it's going into D tier. Up next is the Ironhide Medallion, and this thing can make you like a tank. It reduces damage by a lot, and it lasts for a pretty long time, so it's going to be our first S tier. Next is the Ice Wand, and this can do good amounts of damage, and I believe it stuns enemies, so it's going into B tier. Up next is the Shock Powder, and it just stuns enemies, and I don't see a huge use case for that. It doesn't even do any damage or anything, so I think it belongs in D tier. Up next is the Soul Healer, and I think it belongs in C tier. Next is the Flaming Quiver, and I love quivers, especially with the build that I use. I don't think it's as good as some of the other ones, so it's going into A tier with the Void Quiver. Up next is the Harpoon Quiver, and I wasn't going to rank these ones very high, but I realized that I think they have piercing on them because I just thought at first they were for the underwater DLC, because when you're underwater your arrows don't go very far at all, so I thought that this was a way that you could still use your bow, but testing it out a little bit, it seems like it can actually go through mobs, which seems actually really good, and so they would maybe go into S tier, but I haven't used them enough to know how good they are, so for right now they're going to go into B tier. Up next is the Buzzy Nest, and I'm a huge fan of these. I love the bees. I think they're super helpful, so this is going into A tier for sure. Next is the Soul Lantern, and even though I hardly ever use it and don't use soul builds, it actually does seem quite good because it doesn't take very many souls, and the little guy that it spawns does tons of damage, and it attacks fairly quick, so I'd say that's better than most of the other pets, so it's going into B tier. Up next is the Corrupted Beacon, and to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of it. I know I'm probably going to get flamed for it, but I don't think it's that good because I really hate how it locks you in one place. Because like if you're playing in higher modes, I don't think this does really enough damage to like stop enemies. Like you're kind of just standing in one place, and like especially if the enemies are enchanted, they just be running straight at you and you're just stuck there. They just run straight through your Corrupted Beacon and then kill you. At least that's what my experience has been. And so for that, it's going into C tier. Next is the Torment Quiver, and personally I don't like it as much as some of the other quivers, just because it uses souls, and like I've said before, I hardly ever use soul builds. And second, the range just isn't very far. Like it seems like the arrows don't travel a lot, though it does do a fair amount of damage, and it can go through walls, which I like, and the crowd control aspect of it isn't too bad, so it's going into B tier. Next is the Corrupted Pumpkin, and it's the same as the Corrupted Beacon, but it's a special event item which makes it look cooler, of course, and it's the only unique artifact in the game, and so for that, it's going one tier above into B tier. Up next is the Harvester, and even though I don't use soul builds, I think this is a really good soul item because it has a pretty big area of effect, and it only takes like 40 souls to use, and it can do tons of damage, so I think it's going into A tier. Next is the Deathcap Mushroom, and I'm a huge fan of this one. I use it in most of my builds, and it can just, it does a lot. Any fast attacking weapon, it makes it attack even faster, and any slow attacking weapon makes it attack still pretty quick, like above normal speed most of the time. And so I love this one, and I think it belongs in S tier. Next is the Totem of Regeneration, and this one also belongs in S tier, but for a different reason, and that's being that it's not a very good artifact to just always have on you. I wouldn't argue for that at all, but it is really good for just like you get really low and you don't have a health potion, and so you open up your inventory, you pop this in for a second, you find somewhere safe, you use this real quick, get your health back basically up to full, like this heals you a ton, and then you put it away and switch back to your other artifact. So it's not like good to use all the time, I definitely wouldn't say that, but it is super clutch for those times where you do need it. Next is the Totem of Shielding, and it's going to S tier for mostly the same reasons as the Totem of Regeneration, because like I said with the Totem of Regeneration, you don't want to always carry this one, but it is really good, especially for boss fights. Like, I don't remember what his name is, but in the Desert Temple, the dude that like shoots those green orbs at you, that guy really sucks to fight without the Totem of Shielding. Or the boss in the Ice DLC, I don't remember his name either, but he's also super annoying to fight without the Totem of Shielding, so this, just for every now and again for special boss fights, is just really, really good. Next is Enchanter's Tome, and sadly I hardly ever get to use this one because its only use case is with either pets or when you're playing with other people. It can enchant the people you're playing with or your pets, but since I never play with other people for the most part, and I hardly ever play using pets, I never get to use this one, but I know it is like really quite overpowered, and so it's going into A tier. Up next is the Golem kit, and this has to be my favorite pet in the game. It's super beefy, it does lots of damage, and like I was saying, if you use the Enchanter's Tome with it, then they just become even more overpowered, and so it's going into S tier. Next is the Satchel of Elements, and if you've seen some of my older videos, you know that I used to use 2 of these in my build. They used to kind of be my main artifacts, and that's because they used to be really good, and I would have probably had put them in S tier, but it seems like they lowered the range of them, and so they're not as good as they used to be. I do think they are really quite good because they can hit up to like 7 different targets. It still has like an okay range, and as long as you don't get the freezing one, then it still does a lot of damage. So it would have gone into S tier, but it seems like they nerfed it a little bit, so it's going into A tier. Next is the Love Medallion, and I really love this one, except for there are some like very big flaws that keep it from going too high on the list. And the first one being is that you can't make mobs love you that are already enchanted. So how the Love Medallion works is that you basically enchant mobs to basically be on your side, and it gives them a little damage boost, like 200% or whatever, and it's actually really quite helpful, except for when you're playing on higher difficulties. Basically most of the mobs are enchanted, and with the Love Medallion you can't enchant mobs that are already enchanted, so that's not great. Also, you can use the Love Medallion on creepers, but usually the creepers just keep running straight towards you and then blow up with the damage boost, so basically just tanks all your health, and it really sucks because you can't even stop the creepers at that point because you can't do damage to them. And so for that, sadly, it's going into C tier because of those 2 major flaws. Up next is the Corrupted Seeds, and I don't think there's anything special about them. They're alright, and they're going into C tier. Up next are the Boots of Swiftness, and I really like these because at this level, the duration is basically 4 seconds, and the cooldown is 5 seconds. So you're basically just quick all of the time, you're just always fast, and for me, I love being super quick and super fast, so they're going into S tier. Up next is the Firework Arrow, and this one's definitely going into F tier. Nah, I'm just kidding. Of course, I love this arrow like a ton. This is like what I use in most of my builds, and I'd say it's mostly because of the bow that I use. The Firework Arrow with the Harp Crossbow is just insane, does tons of damage, and with Infinity I can use it more than once. Just overall, it's a great arrow, I love it so much, and it's going into S tier. And finally, we have the Thundering Quiver, and if you've seen like any of my builds, you know that I use the Thundering Quiver like basically all the time, and it's mostly because of the bow I use with the Harp Crossbow. This thing just slaps, it deletes all the mobs off of the face of the level, and it's just incredible, I love it so much, and of course it's going into S tier. Also, as of editing this, I just realized that somehow I managed to miss the Updraft Tomb and the Vexing Chant. I don't know how I missed both of them because I went back and rewatched the video where I got every artifact, and I had both of those artifacts, but while I was making this, for some reason I didn't, and so I missed both of them. So I would rank probably the Updraft Tomb in either S or A. I really like it, can get lots of mobs, does lots of damage, and Vexing Chant probably with the other pets in C or D tier because it's just not my favorite. But there we go, I've now ranked every artifact in the game, and I think I'm quite happy with where I've put everything. I maybe moved the Void Quiver up into S because it is really good. I just don't ever really use it, but overall, I think this is a good list, and of course, don't be offended if I put your favorite artifact in like D or F, because these are just the artifacts that I like to use. I'm not trying to like build like a super good loadout. I'm not trying to like do the meta or whatever. These are just what I like to use and what I think are good. But sadly, that will have to do it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you are new, I'd appreciate if you subscribe. If you like the video, new vids every Thursday, and remember to stay jolly.